I recall the days before everything fell apart as if they belonged to a different life. Susan and I had been together for 6 years, and from the outside, our marriage appeared nearly perfect. We both had put in time and loved to create a home, and when we decided to start a family, it felt like the final piece of the puzzle was falling into place. Our relationship wasn't without its challenges. My job often kept me away for weeks, and there was an unspoken loneliness between us that we never fully addressed. Yet, I believed we were strong enough to endure anything. When Susan told me she was pregnant, I was thrilled. The idea of becoming a father gave me a renewed sense of purpose, and I threw myself into preparing for the baby. We spent hours choosing names, painting the nursery, and planning for our future. I even started working closer to home to be more present for her and the baby. For months, life seemed to be on a wonderful path, but I would soon find out that beneath the surface, things were already falling apart. The scene was almost perfect, like something from a nostalgic painting of family happiness, though it wasn't the kind that would grace a magazine cover. My mother-in-law stood on one side of the hospital bed, and my own mother was on the other, both watching Susan and our newborn daughter, who was breastfeeding. Newborns aren't conventionally cute, but to parents and grandparents, they're perfect. As I watched, I couldn't deny that our daughter was indeed beautiful. Her skin had changed from blotchy red to soft pink, and the waxy coating from birth had been cleaned away. Even her head, initially cone-shaped, had rounded out, giving her a soft, angelic look. I had a feeling she would grow to look like her mother, Susan, my wife of 6 years, whom I had always seen as the love of my life. I quietly observed Susan nursing our baby, while both our mothers offered unnecessary advice. Still, Susan seemed naturally skilled, likely thanks to the parenting classes we had attended, which thoroughly covered breastfeeding and newborn care. As I stepped aside, a nurse and another woman entered the room. "This is Miss Dinkin from administration," the nurse, whose name I couldn't recall, informed us. "She has the birth certificate application for you to fill out." In any other setting, a woman nursing her baby without a shirt while others handled paperwork might seem strange, but here it was normal. "Take your time, finish nursing your baby," Miss Jenkins said to Susan. "When you're ready, fill in the highlighted sections. Most of the information we need is probably in your hospital records, like your date and place of birth, but we'll also need both your full names, your maiden name, your ages, and a few other details. We'll take care of the rest and send it to the parish courthouse. You'll get a copy of the birth certificate in the mail in a couple of weeks." With that, Miss Jenkins turned and left. "Honey, why don't you fill in the details?" "I'm a bit tied up right now," Susan said with a smile. I didn't return the smile. No, I think I'll leave it to you for later, once you're not busy with the baby," I replied. "Besides, we should probably wait until the DNA test results come back to confirm if I'm really the father. If this were a movie, you'd imagine the sound of a record needle screeching to a stop. Everything froze. 3 of the 4 women stared at me, mouths agape in shock. The 4th, the baby, was the only one not looking, but she was the only one who made a sound when her feeding was suddenly interrupted. Her cry barely covered the collective gasps. My mother-in-law was the first to speak. "Are you out of your mind? Why would you even suggest something like that?" she shouted, glancing at Susan, whose face shifted from shock to confusion and then to anger. "How dare you accuse me of having someone else's baby? What kind of woman do you think I am?" Susan shot back. Then she hesitated, attempting a weak smile. "Oh, I get it. It's April Fool's Day. You're pulling a prank on us. Well, it's not funny at all. You should know better." Her body language told a different story. Her shock was unmistakable. I stood there watching her. "I'm completely serious," I said coldly. "There's a real chance I'm not the father. How could you possibly think I'd cheat on you? Have I ever given you any reason to suspect me?" she demanded. Ignoring her question, I continued. "So you're going with your usual response, deny, and you're doing it with a straight face too. I've got to say, I'm impressed." I turned to my mother-in-law. "Maybe I should move the car seat from my car to yours, so you can take her and the baby home this afternoon. It would be helpful if you could stay with Susan for a while. Although both you and Mom have offered before, we insisted we could handle it, but she could really use the support since I won't be around." As I started to leave the room, a firm command from behind stopped me in my tracks. "Stop right there, Jason Lewis." My mother's voice demanded my attention. I turned and faced her, bracing myself for what was coming. Both my mother and mother-in-law exchanged worried glances while Susan began sobbing uncontrollably. "No, you can't leave me and little Connie. She's our baby." "You're her daddy," Susan cried, before responding to my mother. I addressed Susan. "I know I'm supposed to be the daddy, but am I actually the father? There's a difference, you know." My mom snapped me back to attention with a poke to my chest. She closed the small gap between us, grabbed the front of my shirt, and pulled me close, locking eyes with me like she did when I was a kid. "What the hell is wrong with you, Jason? Why this sudden stupidity? You can't back out of fatherhood now. That's done. You were thrilled when Sue told us she was pregnant. You've been devouring baby care books, buying and assembling the crib, changing table, and everything for the nursery. You even painted it pink and yellow with cute little animals. Every week, you bring home a new toy, some she won't use until she's walking." Mom paused, giving me a piercing look. "So what's with the sudden change of heart?" I admitted, "I've had a bit of an epiphany. I'm not as eager about this anymore. I'm sure you've noticed." "Hey, Tony," my mother-in-law chimed in. "We've all noticed you haven't held Connie or even really looked at her. We thought the reality of being a dad was just sinking in. What's going on?" "If that baby's mine, I'll do everything to take care of her and be a great father," I declared so intensely that both my mother and Tony stepped back. I was fully committed, but that changed last week when I found out I might not be the father. I'm not bonding with a child I won't be raising. What came was the outcry from 3 voices, nearly in unison. "I'll provide for her if she's mine, but if not, Clive Adams can take responsibility for his own child," I said loudly. At the mention of that name, Susan suddenly cried out, "Clive and I never did anything. We've never been physically engaged. How can you accuse me of that?" As I moved closer to the foot of her bed, Mom and Tony exchanged glances, their eyes darting between Susan and me. "Really? You're still going to deny that you had an affair for almost 6 months, and only ended it 7 months ago after finding out you were pregnant? And telling him, from what I've heard, he told you to make sure I never found out." Susan's face flushed. "No, we absolutely did not. Anyone who says otherwise is lying. Who is Clive Adams? And who told you about this so-called affair?" Tony demanded. Her voice was rising. "I want to know who's spreading lies about my daughter." Ignoring the first question, I answered the second. "Clive Adams himself," I said quietly before Tony could react. Perhaps because of her exhaustion and distress, Susan blurted it out. "Clive would never tell you that," he promised. Tony looked back and forth between her daughter and me, catching on to Susan's slip. "I need to know exactly what you know," she said firmly. I paused before addressing Susan. "Clive spilled everything. He confessed it all. But to be fair, he was under a lot of pressure at the time, and he let it all out in the middle of his screams." I admitted. "That's nonsense," Susan replied, her voice shaky. "Clive was just fine when he called me yesterday to check on me and the baby." Her exhaustion, after giving birth, was apparent, and she may not have realized the slip-up, but her words hit us all. Tony slumped a bit, and I glanced at my mother, who was wide-eyed, taking it all in. "So, you're still in touch with your old flame?" I said. "Did he give you more advice on how to keep me in the dark about him possibly being the father?" Susan broke down into sobs. Her crying was so intense that 2 nurses rushed into the room. "We were so careful. There was no way you could have known. No one knew," Susan sobbed. "She's just a little overwhelmed," I told the first nurse, who shot me a protective glare on behalf of her patient. I suppose my tone might have sounded odd to her. "We were just discussing potential fathers to put on the birth certificate application," I added. The nurse continued to look at me with suspicion. "Well, it seems she expects me to fill in my name, but I'd rather wait until we know for sure if I'm the father, or if it's the guy she was seeing when she got pregnant." I could tell by the nurse's expression that she was starting to understand. She turned her attention to comforting Susan. "Miss Font, let's calm down now. Remember your breathing techniques from labor? Cheryl will get something to help you relax if needed, but let's try natural methods first." We don't want anything passing into your milk, right? So let's start with some deep breathing. Inhale with me deeply. As I watched the nurse soothing Susan, I didn't notice my mom and mother-in-law approaching. You need to explain what's going on, my mom whispered sharply. I was startled. Mom rarely spoke this way, but she'd done it twice today. Clearly, something big was happening. Judging by Sue's reaction, my mother-in-law added, I want to know the full story. What, when, and how. This is completely unexpected. Well, it should be obvious, I replied, glaring at both women. I was getting annoyed that I was the target of their frustration. Not Susan. She was involved with a coworker when she got pregnant. At least one other man besides me. I can't say for sure if there were more. Susan pulled herself together surprisingly fast, considering she'd seemed on the verge of a breakdown just moments earlier. We were so careful, she asked, her voice filled with desperation. I saw the same questioning look from my mom and Tony. They were eager to know more. Yes, you were very discreet, I said. I had no idea. I neither did anyone else. I admitted. But Clive, being the charming seducer he is, couldn't resist bragging. He needed to show off his conquests, and this time, his latest one. He couldn't help himself. You know Cheryl Watkins, right? I asked, and Susan nodded. Cheryl had been her co-worker for years. Cheryl and her husband, Steve, were part of our social circle. Well, Clive almost convinced Cheryl to meet him at a hotel. Her biggest fear was that he might talk, and her husband would find out. She wasn't sure she could trust him to stay quiet, so to prove he could keep a secret, he spilled the details of his past affairs, whatever you want to call them. Conquests, hookups, girlfriends. He dropped a few names and gave enough details to make her believe him. He even asked if she could guess who else he'd been involved with, excluding his public girlfriends, married women, or single women from work, of course. She couldn't. So to further convince her, he mentioned some women from the office she knew. The one before you was Sandy, he said. She backed out after a few months when her husband got suspicious. Then it was you for 6 months, but you ended things when you found out you were pregnant. Clive told Cheryl you were hoping your husband was the baby's father, but he wasn't willing to keep the affair going. He made sure Cheryl understood how crucial it was that your husband, meaning me, never found out because he thought I might leave you and not want to deal with child support during that time. You were very open about your pregnancy. You were happy and shared the news with everyone at work. But despite your excitement, I noticed you didn't show any concern about who the baby's father was. It seemed like you assumed I wouldn't question it, and even if I did, I'd stay committed to the child and ignore any doubts. But that's not something I was willing to accept. I paused briefly, letting my words sink in. Susan sat in silence, her face betraying emotions she struggled to hide. Tony and Mom listened intently, absorbing every word. They wanted answers just as much as I did. It turns out Lana Richard was Clive's next affair. Her husband grew suspicious when she suddenly started working late, so she had to be cautious. She ended up being late to pick up their youngest from daycare a few times. With this disruption in his bed life, Clive shifted his attention to Cheryl and succeeded again. As I said, he's a smooth talker, telling her exactly what she wanted to hear to win her over. Apparently, he's also quite skilled in bed, keeping his married partner satisfied and coming back for months. Tony and Mom exchanged glances, then turned to Susan. And how exactly did Cheryl end up confessing? Mom asked, trying to piece everything together. It wasn't on purpose, I explained. Apparently, Cheryl's quite vocal during closeness, I added, making Tony wince. She accidentally called out Clive's name in the heat of the moment. Her husband, Steve, pushed her about it, and she confessed. I chuckled, recalling the story Steve had shared over a beer. Cheryl wasn't one for primal noises like Susan. She preferred to say exactly what she wanted during closeness. According to Steve, one night Cheryl shouted, "Give it to me, Clive. I love it." But Steve sounds nothing like Clive, and of course, Steve knew him. He was well aware of Clive's reputation as a womanizer, or as we guys say, a ladies' man. He connected the dots and confronted Cheryl. That's how he explained it to me. Mom and Tony looked shocked by the details, unable to hide their reactions. When Larry, Lana's husband, found out, he was furious. As you know, Larry's a police officer, and being in law enforcement adds another level of complexity. He kept quiet for a week, waiting for the baby to arrive before taking any action. We didn't want to put any extra stress on Susan in her final stages of pregnancy, but now that the baby is here, it's time to be upfront about what Clive has done and the fallout that comes with it. Tony's face turned pale. Her disbelief was obvious. So you're telling me this Clive Adams was involved with several women, including my daughter, and there's a chance Connie is his? She asked, her voice shaking with anger and disappointment. Yes, I responded bluntly. And Clive has no idea, or maybe he does and just doesn't care about the damage he's caused. Silence filled the room for a moment before my mom finally spoke. So what's the next step? I sighed, feeling the weight of my decisions. I've already submitted a DNA test. I spoke with the head nurse the day after the baby was born. Since Susan and I are married, I didn't need her consent to test the baby. I opted for an expedited test, and it'll take 2 to 3 days to get the results. Tony hesitantly asked, do you think you could find it in your heart to forgive Sue and move on, even if you're not the baby's biological father? I noticed she referred to the child as the baby instead of using her name, a small but telling shift from her usual way of speaking. Tony was perceptive and could read me well, but it was clear she still held on to some hope. Glancing at my mom, I saw that she had already figured out my feelings, and while she understood, she wasn't happy about it. To be honest, I'm not sure I can move past this, even if I am the father. I admitted, I've had just over a week to process it. This wasn't a one-time mistake like a drunken fling. It was a 6-month affair. I can't trust her anymore. She didn't just disrespect me in our marriage. She risked getting pregnant by that guy while we were actively trying for a baby. She told the whole family that we decided to conceive. Her continued affair with Clive shows me she didn't care who the father of her child was. Have you considered couples therapy? My mom interjected, possibly trying to cut off any arguments from Susan's family. And remember the baby, it's not her fault. That little girl will need a father, even if you're not her biological dad. You could still be her daddy. I sighed again. Like I said earlier, Mom, I doubt therapy will help. What I really want to understand is where I went wrong as a husband. There had to be something I did or didn't do that led Susan to betray me. It's not like she was looking to replace me. Clive's a known womanizer. He'd never commit to her, and I'm sure she knew that. Shaking my head, I felt the frustration rising. I'm trying not to say the hard things that are on my mind. Neither of them deserves my anger right now, but I'm on edge and close to snapping. Aside from the physical attraction or maybe some thrill, I can't see any other reason for this. I thought our relationship was strong. Both women listened quietly as I continued. You can imagine how shattered I've been since I found out. Just like you said, Mom, I was so excited about becoming a father. Then out of nowhere, everything collapsed. My entire world fell apart. Honestly, at this point, I almost hope I'm not the father. Both women seemed surprised by my admission. That way, I wouldn't have to deal with being a part-time dad. Honestly, I'm not sure I can handle interacting with Susan, even if the baby is mine. That's going to take a lot of therapy. Just then, the nurse came out of the room and said, Mr. Font, no, your wife wants to speak with you. She mentioned she knows you're still here. Otherwise, her mother would have returned by now. She seemed to convey some sympathy toward my feelings. At least that's how it appeared. But she stopped me before I could head back in. If you do go in, I hope you can stay calm. I understand you're upset, but please try not to upset her further. We'd rather avoid using sedation. She's scheduled for discharge this afternoon, and it wouldn't be ideal to give her extra medication that could pass to the baby through her milk. Based on your childbirth classes, I'm sure you know how important colostrum and early breast milk are for the baby's immune system. I nodded, realizing she was appealing to my concern for the baby's well-being, regardless of whose child it was. Maybe you should go talk to her mom, gently suggested Tony, and I can grab some coffee, hand me your car keys, and we'll move the car seat. I'll wait for you to finish. Oh, and before you leave, swing by the nursery and take a good look at Connie. I think she looks a lot like you when you were born. Wishful thinking, Mom? Or are you just seeing what you want to see? I asked. She shrugged, clearly unhappy with the situation. I knew that if I was the father, she would be deeply involved in helping raise the baby, regardless of what happened between Susan and me. Mom was already invested in her role as a grandmother, just as I'd been preparing for fatherhood. It was obvious she hadn't fully accepted the possibility that the baby might not be her grandchild. I entered the room, and as soon as Susan saw me, she broke down crying again. "You must hate me," she sobbed. "No, I don't hate you. That's the problem," I replied, trying to stay calm. "I hate what you did, and I'm so angry I can barely think straight." Deep down, I wanted to shake her and storm out. If there wasn't the small chance the baby was mine, I would have left already, but I needed answers. "Do you really want to talk now, or would you prefer a few extra days to figure out how to explain this?" I asked, my tone clearly sharp. Susan began to speak, but I cut her off. "Even though I wanted answers, you've had 9 months to think about what to say. If I ever found out you were cheating with Clive Adams of all people—" My voice shook as I said his name. "Clive Adams," I repeated, pausing to take a few deep breaths. "No, I didn't think he might be the father. That was you. I thought I was having our baby, not his." Susan defended herself. "Your baby? I might be the father, but it seems doubtful." To her credit, she looked genuinely shocked. "Oh, come on," I continued. "I was still offshore on a rig during the first week of July when you supposedly got pregnant. Most of it, anyway. I checked my work schedules to be sure. I remember coming home near the end of the week, and we made up for lost time. We were physically engaged right away, just like usual or how we used to be. I thought that's when you got pregnant. That's what I told the guys at work. I had no idea Clive was in the picture." As soon as Susan started to protest, I interrupted again. "What about the weeks before that? Right until I got off the helicopter. Did you have him over while I was away? Move him in? Did you sleep with him in our bed?" I kept going, letting the questions flow. "Not that it matters where, it's that you did it." "No, Susan," shouted he. "He never came to the house, except for those few times we hosted barbecues and invited people from work. We were careful. We wouldn't risk a neighbor seeing him or his car parked at the house, but not careful enough to avoid getting pregnant." "So you can't say a rubber broke," I said coldly. "Clive seems like the type to take risks, or at least push boundaries, as long as he benefits." I added, "I got tested for STDs this past week. I suggest you get screened too." Susan muttered softly. "That was part of my early pregnancy exams." I was a little surprised as I didn't think that was routine. "I told my doctor I wanted to make sure you hadn't caught something while you were away for work," she admitted sheepishly. I felt my face flush with anger. "So, your OBGYN thinks I might have been the one cheating, and instead of telling the truth, you let her believe that?" I had more questions, and I needed answers. Why did you cheat, and why with him? Why would you risk getting pregnant by Clive? Why not just go back on birth control and pretend you wanted to wait longer to have a baby, so you could sleep with him without the risk? Susan looked down. "I don't know. I was lonely. You were gone a lot. I was aroused, and Clive was there. We started talking, and before I knew it, we were already close." She hesitated, clearly struggling with the next part. "As for why I didn't go back on birth control, I was already seeing Clive before we decided I'd stop taking it. He refuses to use rubbers. I take a shower afterward to lower the risk a little." I muttered sarcastically, "Keeping your legs closed would have been a better option." Susan looked shocked, and I hoped she wouldn't shut down before I got more answers. "So you cheated on me for about 4 months before getting pregnant, and then kept it going for another 2 months after I asked, trying to push the conversation forward." Susan nodded. "I suspected I might be pregnant, but I didn't want to stop until I was sure. I justified it by thinking if I was already pregnant, it didn't matter if I kept seeing him." She winced at her own choice of words. "Clive ended things after I told him about the baby," she admitted. "He didn't want to risk you finding out and having to be responsible if the baby was his." "So you two talked about your options?" "Yes," I said. "We both thought you'd never suspect that Connie wasn't yours," she said quietly, "and there was a good chance she wasn't his, especially since you came home that first week in July. We were together all the time, and I didn't see Clive at all when you were home," she added. "So you had a relationship with Clive while I was away working to support us in the life we wanted," I said, piecing it together. "Was it out of resentment because I wasn't around?" I almost asked the harsher question but held back. Susan quickly shook her head, trying to dismiss the implications. No, it wasn't like that, she insisted. It was purely physical. I felt desire fire when you were away. Clive and I only had physical closeness when you were out of town. We met at his place 3 or 4 evenings a week. We were careful. I didn't stay overnight every time and tried to make it seem like I was mostly home. We never showed any affection at work that would suggest we were more than friendly colleagues. Her words sounded rehearsed, as if she had been justifying it to herself for a long time. And no, he's not better in doubt, and he's not better in bed, she added, sensing my unspoken questions. We didn't do anything you and I don't normally do. It's just that he was there when you weren't. It was fun and exciting. That's the best way to put it. And no, I didn't do it to get back at you. It was something I did for myself. Her honesty stung. It felt as if the affair had become something she rationalized for her own satisfaction. I clenched my jaw. If you were only mine when I was around, you were never really mine, I said, trying to hold my gaze steady. You were my wife, but his mistress. You were so careful not to get caught, but then you got pregnant, I added bitterly. I guess you never thought about what would happen if I found out later that our oldest child wasn't mine. Maybe because of a blood type difference, or if she didn't look like our other kids. That's assuming you didn't cheat again and let another man father your next child. Or go back to Clive for another one. Susan shook her head frantically. No, I promised I'd never cheat on you again. And I knew once you bonded with Connie, you'd never leave her, even if she wasn't biologically yours. Just look at how you've already been with her. You're fully devoted to that baby, even Clive agrees. A few points for you, I guess, I said sarcastically. You and Clive kept talking about the possibility he was the father. You mentioned he called yesterday to check on you. And it's obvious you two discussed how to manage me, keeping me in the dark and planning for my reaction. Susan started to fidget, clearly uncomfortable. And the key word here is was, as in I was invested in being that baby's daddy, I said coldly. Both moms noticed I haven't held her once. I haven't changed her diaper, swaddled her, or even taken more than a quick look at her from afar. I'll make an effort to change that if the DNA test shows I'm the father, after all. I looked her straight in the eye. Let me ask you something. Did it ever really matter to you whether I was the father or Clive? Susan didn't deny it. Of course, I wanted you to be the father, she admitted. But once I found out I was pregnant, I just wanted the baby. I knew she would be adorable, and you wouldn't suspect anything. You and Clive don't look that different, same hair color, similar build. You'd be her daddy, and it wouldn't matter. I felt a wave of bitterness rise inside me. You know, I've been cutting back on my time offshore. I gave up some of that big bonus money and started spending more time in the office, managing things from there. I even took a pay cut. You seemed happy I was home more, or at least that's what I thought. If my being away was such a problem, you should have spoken up long ago. All you had to do was ask. Everything I did was for you. Susan began crying again, but this time it didn't affect me. Well, that's about to change. If I'm not the father, I'm going back to the rigs. I'll stay out there until I find a woman who actually wants to be with me, and only me, not someone who can't keep her vows or her legs closed when I'm not around. I said angrily. Her tears continued, but they barely registered with me. But I need you to help take care of the baby, she sobbed. We're a family. What about us? We've done so well these past 7 months. I've been a devoted wife. I haven't looked at another man since then. We could try counseling. Right now, I'm not sure they're still on us. We'll figure things out if the DNA test shows I'm the father, but for now, I'm not staying here, not until I get those results. I've already packed up the things that matter to me. Her face showed pure shock as she stared at me, disbelieving. Where will you go? She asked softly, her voice trembling with fear. I've rented an apartment. I arranged it last week. I wanted to wait until the baby was born before leaving, I said coldly. Tony will stay with you for now, and maybe my mom will help too. She's hoping it's her grandchild. With that, I turned and walked out of the room. Susan continued crying, though not as intensely as before. On my way out, I nearly ran into Tony and my mother, who had clearly been eavesdropping by the door. Yeah, I heard you. Sue me, Tony said bitterly. But don't give up hope. There's still a chance for reconciliation, especially if Connie is your daughter, she added, ever the optimist. I turned to her, my voice sharp. Really, you claim you were listening, but did you miss the key points? Like the fact that she never once apologized for cheating. She feels no guilt. She just justified it by saying she was lonely and aroused, as if that excuses anything. She didn't even care about whether I'm the father or not. She just expects me to deal with it and accept everything. That's just disgusting. Tony looked stunned by my intensity, her eyes filling with tears. Mom stepped in, trying to calm things down. We moved the car seat and secured it, she said gently. I'm going to pack a bag and stay for a few days. Even if you're not the father, Sue has been like a daughter to me for the last 6 years. I can't just abandon her. Not yet, at least. But don't get me wrong, I don't condone what she did. I'm angry too. If she hadn't just had a baby, I think Tony and I would both tell her how foolish she's been. I nodded, appreciating her honesty. When they asked, I shared the location of my new apartment but didn't mention that I had already consulted a lawyer and taken steps to protect my share of the assets. I had settled our credit card debts and secured our investment accounts. I even instructed the lawyer to prepare divorce papers, citing infidelity, despite it not being recognized in our state. Although Susan would be homebound for a few days, I couldn't risk her accessing our finances online, so I took precautions. I was almost certain our marriage was beyond repair. The small bit of doubt I had, based on the happiness we'd once shared, vanished completely. Trusting her again seemed impossible. On my way to my new apartment, I called Steve, needing some company over a drink. I had planned to take a few weeks off work after the baby was born to help my wife adjust, sort of like a male version of maternity leave. But right now, being alone wasn't what I wanted. Since Steve had a flexible schedule, he met me at the bar where he worked for his father-in-law's company. He figured he wouldn't be there much longer, especially after Cheryl's confession. You talked to Susan, I take it? Steve asked. I confirmed and shared the details of our conversation. I've consulted the same lawyer you did, I said. Luckily, Cheryl's father insisted on a prenuptial agreement when we got married. He wanted to protect his business. While Cheryl has some stock, she doesn't get dividends or have any real influence. She'll keep the stock, but I'll get nearly everything else. We had talked about this before, and Steve knew Susan would be entitled to half of our shared assets, which was a significant amount. Both of us had contributed financially to the marriage, with Susan earning a good salary. I was hoping to stir things up enough to avoid paying her alimony. I thought Tony might help with that, I added. As for child support, it only mattered if the baby was mine, which I still doubted. I'm going to pay for this, I grumbled. The courts will punish me, even though I did nothing wrong. Steve nodded. Larry and I went to see Dawn Duckett's husband and told him about her affair with Clive, he said. As expected, he was furious. Larry, being a cop, warned him not to do anything reckless. I nodded. Don was mad at us too. He couldn't believe we were just going to let Clive get away with making fools of us. He called us weak for not confronting Clive right away. Larry surprised me by saying, "Who said anything about letting that idiot off easy?" I told Don not to do anything stupid, nothing that would get him caught. Clive isn't worth going to jail over, just because he acted impulsively. Don may be quick-tempered, but he's not dumb, Steve added. He said so. I just need to make sure I don't get caught when someone deals with Clive. We joked about it, and he calmed down enough to listen. I chuckled darkly. Yeah, we know something has to be done about that idiot. Clive needs to be dealt with, but it has to be done carefully. Castrating him isn't the right answer. Steve gave me a baffled look. You must be out of your mind, he said. He can't just walk away from this. Even if he can't have more kids, he still has financial responsibilities, and he's accountable for destroying marriages, yours, mine, and probably Don's. Larry might stay with Lana for now because of their kids, but his decision depends on how Lana reacts when he confronts her tonight. He been putting it off because of you, I replied. Well, Clive's lies will start falling apart once these women warn him. He won't stick around for long. His problem is he's too easy to track. People underestimate how hard it is to disappear completely. You can't make the kind of money Clive wants while staying off the grid. He's in trouble, trust me. But if we already know about 4 women he's been with, there are probably more. It's like finding needles in a haystack. If you shake the hay and 4 needles fall out, the whole stack must be full of them. I added that we need to track down other husbands who might be angry with him too. Steve laughed at the metaphor. As for punishing him, I'd prefer he keeps at least 1 testicle intact and undamaged. Steve looked puzzled. Why just 1? I explained. If he loses both, he could still take hormone replacements and keep having sex. But if you leave him with 1, we could damage it, perhaps causing him some lasting discomfort, which would prevent him from repeating his behavior without resorting to anything extreme. Plus, it'll mess with him psychologically. Steve burst out laughing, knowing he'd eventually share my idea with Larry and Dawn. He had already spoken to them and knew they'd get the humor. 2 days later, I stopped by the house where Susan and I used to live. Tony answered the door. You didn't waste any time, did you? She asked bitterly. Susan got the divorce papers this morning, I said, feeling a mix of guilt and relief. She's been crying nonstop since then. The only time she seems okay is when she's caring for Connie. I paused, then added, I can't really blame you, but I thought you'd hold off. She's really upset. Tony shook her head. I doubt she'd even consider another relationship after all this, she whispered. Tony asked, still holding on to hope. Do you think there's any chance for reconciliation if you both go to counseling? I shook my head. I was already convinced there was no future for us as a couple, and this just confirms it, I said, handing her the paternity test report. The baby isn't mine. Tony looked at the envelope, tears streaming down her face. She was heartbroken. The weight of her shattered hopes and dreams hit her hard. After a final hug, she turned to break the news to her daughter. I had already told my own mother, who was deeply upset at losing the chance to be a grandmother. Angry about Susan's infidelity, she had chosen to stay home and not be with Tony and Susan while waiting for the DNA results. She, too, was a sufferer of Susan's and Clive's betrayal. The whole town was buzzing about Clive Adams and his affairs with married women in the days that followed. Steve, Larry, Dawn, and I confronted our wives, and we didn't hold back on naming him. In fact, we made a point of exposing his actions, though none of us liked the label of betrayed. We stood firm and shared how our wives had fallen for his charm. Clive's strategy seemed to involve bragging about his past conquests to Cheryl, and the other women were swayed by his smooth talk despite their seemingly happy marriages. They were drawn in by Clive's allure and enjoyed what he had to offer. As his affairs became public knowledge, fathers of babies born to women linked to him started demanding paternity tests. I later heard about 2 more children he fathered. Suspicious husbands began questioning their wives about their activities, and some couples even sought counseling. The full extent of his actions remained hidden until he confessed directly to the police. You'd think someone living the life Clive chose would keep his assets liquid, ready to flee at a moment's notice. But instead of converting his high income into cash, stocks, or easily transferable assets, Clive decided to buy a house and invest in multiple real estate properties. Even his home furnishings were extravagant, with valuable artwork on the walls alongside the typical hunting and fishing gear common in our area. His boat was outfitted for both water skiing and fishing. While law enforcement may not have initially pursued him, even if Clive had managed to liquidate his assets and flee, private investigators could still have tracked him down. It's hard to completely disappear when your social security number is needed for any high-income, non-cash job, no matter how far you run. Clive may not have fully grasped the danger he was in. Geographically, he severely underestimated the anger of the husbands. Instead of leaving the area right away, he stayed and paid the price. Just a few days after word of his affairs spread, Clive was found on the sidewalk near his house during his morning jog. He was in shock and barely conscious. A passing jogger found him and immediately called an ambulance. She couldn't cut the straps binding his arms behind his back when she tried to roll him over. He screamed, so she wisely stopped, fearing she might make things worse. When paramedics arrived, they discovered his groin had been crushed. The tool used was a 3-pound sledgehammer. I picked up this detail from Larry, the cop, while we were at the bar. He shared the story with Steve, Dawn, and me, both cheerfully and seriously mentioning how 2 detectives had jokingly told him that if he ever had a 3-pound hammer with mysterious tissue on it, he should toss it into the swamp. I had nothing to do with what happened to that guy's manhood, Larry said with a sly wink and a barely concealed smirk. I'm just passing along what my fellow officers told me. Clive had no idea who attacked him. He vividly remembered hearing his doorbell ring. Whether it was late the previous night or early that morning, he couldn't recall. It was dark, and he had been asleep. I think they used a taser, Clive told investigators. They shocked me down there a few times. I remember that there might have been 2 of them, but I'm not sure. I was pretty out of it. One of them said something about not going after another man's wife. After that, it was just unbearable pain. Understandably desperate to see his attackers brought to justice, Clive gave the investigators the names of every woman he had been involved with over the past few years, married or otherwise. The list was surprisingly long, with so many leads to follow that the investigation became complicated. Despite numerous suspects, no solid evidence pointed to anyone, and because the timing of the attack was unclear, alibis were difficult to confirm. Privately, Larry confided to Steve and me that the investigating detectives believed Clive Adams had gotten what he deserved. After a few months, the investigation tinctured and reached a dead end, as expected. Susan received half of our shared property. The house was sold, and a new family moved in, bringing their young daughter into the nursery I had painstakingly painted with little animal designs. I hoped she appreciated the care I'd put into it. Susan moved back to her mother's house, since she struggled to care for the baby alone. At least with Tony, she wouldn't be lonely. I had no interest in her romantic life anymore. Susan called me once to apologize, likely after Tony pressured her. However, she didn't clarify what she was apologizing for, whether it was for the infidelity, getting pregnant by another man, or for me finding out and divorcing her. I didn't ask. By then, I had moved on. When she suggested meeting to talk, I declined. She also asked if I knew about Clive's situation and whether I had any involvement. I simply said he got what he deserved and ended the call. After that, we never spoke again, and everything was handled through our lawyers. I often wondered how much Susan would spend trying to legally force Clive to pay child support, knowing he wouldn't do so willingly. She'd eventually get it, but hiring a lawyer would drain her savings. Clive was facing several similar lawsuits, and I heard steps were being taken to stop him from selling his real estate. Between his medical bills, legal fees, and upcoming child support obligations, he wouldn't have much left, and that's assuming he could keep his job. 18 months later at 3 in the morning, I stood leaning against the lower rail of the Econ 626 rig in the Gulf of Mexico. The cool autumn breeze was refreshing, and my lightweight windbreaker kept me warm. It was one of my last routine visits to the rigs. I had met a woman and decided she was worth pursuing. We had a great connection. While I wasn't sure where it would lead, I was now open to the future. It was time to accept the job offer at headquarters that I had turned down twice before. As I unzipped my jacket, I felt the weight of the lump hanging over my belt. Its persistence confused me, though I had tried to get rid of it many times. I couldn't bring myself to let go. The risk of keeping it made no sense, yet it gave me a strange comfort. It was like I had reclaimed a part of myself. Without further thought, I pulled out the heavy hammer from its hiding place and threw it into the sea. After that moment in the hospital when I walked out on Susan and Connie, the world seemed to slow down. Everything felt detached, like I was watching my life play out from a distance, unable to control anything, just a bystander to the wreckage I had helped create. The days turned into a blur, each one feeling like a burden heavier than the last. Work was my salvation, if you could call it that. But even the rig, which had once felt like a second home, became a place where I couldn't escape my own thoughts. I rented a small apartment not far from the house where we used to live, a cold, impersonal place, like a motel room stayed in for a few nights and then moved on. I didn't furnish it much. What was the point? I spent most of my time out of the place anyway. If I wasn't at work, I was at the bar, nursing beers and my broken pride. It's funny how things fall apart all at once, like a dam bursting after the smallest crack. Susan and I had been good, hadn't we? Or was that just my version of the story? Maybe I'd been blind all along, ignoring the signs because I didn't want to admit the truth, that our marriage had cracked long before Clive slithered his way in. For weeks after leaving, I debated whether to meet Connie again. My mother kept asking, "Have you gone to see the baby yet?" as if seeing her would somehow make me forget everything. But how could I look at her without wondering if she really was mine? I told myself I'd stay away until the DNA results came back, but even after they confirmed what I'd feared, that I wasn't the father, I couldn't stay away. There was this part of me, twisted as it sounds, that was still drawn to her, to the baby I had prepared for, to the life I had imagined. In a way, I felt like I was abandoning not just Susan, but a part of myself. I did eventually go back, not for Susan, but for Connie. It wasn't some big emotional reunion or anything, no grand gestures. I walked in, Tony handed me the baby without a word, and I sat down on that same couch where I had once imagined our family's future. Holding her, though, wasn't the catharsis I had hoped for. I stared down at her tiny face, and all I could see was Clive's betrayal, Susan's lies. Connie was innocent in all of it, sure, but that didn't make it easier. It didn't make me forget. Tony's voice pulled me out of my thoughts, reminding me that I couldn't escape reality forever. "You're not the father," she said quietly but firmly, as if she were trying to convince herself just as much as me. "You don't know anything." I left without looking back after that day. I made a conscious decision to move on, and by move on, I mean I tried to bury myself in work, in anything that kept my mind busy. I accepted the job at headquarters I'd been offered months ago, trading in my time offshore for a desk job in the city. The rhythm of office life was different, and yet no matter how far I went, I couldn't outrun the echoes of what had happened. But something strange started to happen as time went on. I met someone new. Her name was Lily, and she was unlike anyone I'd ever known. There was a quiet strength to her, a calmness I didn't realize I needed until it was there. We met through mutual friends, and what started as casual dinners turned into something deeper. She didn't push me to talk about what had happened with Susan, thank God, but she was there when I needed to talk, even if all I could offer were pieces of a broken story. With Lily, things were different. She made me believe in a future again, one where the past didn't have to define me. I found myself opening up, slowly, cautiously, and she, in turn, trusted me with her own past, her own scars. It wasn't perfect, but it was, and after everything, I realized that maybe that was enough. It's been 3 years since the day I walked out of that hospital room. Susan and I never spoke again, except through lawyers. Connie is someone else's responsibility now, and I've come to accept that. I still think about her sometimes, but less and less as time goes by. As for Clive, he got what was coming to him. I'll admit there are still nights when I think about the hammer, what it meant, why I kept it for so long. Maybe it was my way of holding on to control, of reminding myself that, but even though everything fell apart, I wasn't completely powerless. But when I finally let it go, threw it into the sea, it felt like a release, a final goodbye to the man I used to be. Now, with Lily by my side, I'm learning to be someone new, someone better. The scars are still there, but they don't define me anymore. I'm not the man who lost everything. I'm the man who chose to rebuild. And for the first time in a long time, I think that's enough.